Hello and welcome back to Newbie Debate. This is going to be over the stock issues today. It's labeled Stock Issues 101/102, mainly because this is designed for novices, but I think that there's probably a lot of people out there that learned about the stock issues from what I would call like a what understanding rather than a why understanding. And so hopefully today, even if you think you know the stock issues, you can double check your knowledge and make sure that you know why these things operate the way that they do, and not just that you were told this is what this is and you kind of just operate under the fact that it just exists. So let's go ahead and start with the stock issues. So debate is fundamentally a question about whether or not the AF's version of the resolution is true. So the AF is going to say the resolution is true. The United States federal government should blank because, and then they insert their plan, which is a smaller version of that resolution. The resolution might be a wholesale statement like we should establish national health insurance in the United States, but then the AF might have a specific way to establish national health insurance, which, if they prove that that is true, then they're proving the resolution true. Like we said in previous lectures, it's just a recap. Resolutions use the term should, which means it's a question of whether or not we should do the plan. In order to prove that, traditionally, affirmatives do that by proving a few stock issues true, which are core issues in the debate. So there's technically five, but we're going to focus on the main four, and then we'll talk about the outlier in a second. First is inherency. So inherency deals with what's happening right now. So in order to prove that you should do something, you have to also prove that we aren't already doing it, which seems pretty self-explanatory, but that's what inherency is dealing with. It's a question of whether or not the affirmative plan has happened or is in the process of happening. Reason why that's important is because if the affirmative team is able to defend a plan that has already happened, then there's not really a lot of room for the negative to debate it. And not only that, but you can argue it just doesn't prove the resolution true because the word should implies that something needs to happen and not that we're proving that something has already happened. There's a variety of different arguments relating to inherency, but the core thing to take away is it's a question of whether or not the plan has happened. Harms. Harms asks why there's a problem or what that problem is. This one, alongside solvency, is where a lot of the debate will happen because, generally speaking, if someone's reading an AF case, it's probably inherent. Now, you should always question that because it sometimes isn't, but biggest issue is going to be harms and solvency. But harms is a question of what specifically is happening that's bad that the affirmative is trying to solve for. So the affirmative, if they were passing a national health insurance policy, might identify a harm to be people's unequal access to healthcare, or perhaps that there is a risk of disease through people not being insured and getting access to healthcare. Solvency is a question of how do you solve for that problem? Like, how does the plan solve for whatever harms they identify? So one's pretty self-explanatory. It's a logical next step of the harms. It's a question of how the affirmative solves for the harms, and it's their burden to prove, like, what do you do about it? The final one that we're going to talk about in this slide is topicality. It's a question of whether or not the affirmative falls under the topic. Because if we're trying to prove the resolution true, the affirmative's plan has to fall under that resolution, or else, even though they proved that this plan was a good idea, they didn't prove the resolution is true through that plan because that plan isn't under the resolution. This one is not one that the affirmative needs to defend in their first speech. It's one that actually the affirmative ends up defending in the second affirmative constructive, assuming that the negative brings up arguments that they are not topical. So it's a question of whether or not the affirmative is under the topic. The final stock issue is called significance. This one is largely covered within harms and topicality, under my personal opinion. It deals with whether or not the affirmative is a significant issue. In policy debate resolutions, affirmatives are typically required to be substantial or significant or some other similar modifier. And so if an affirmative isn't significant, then it probably is just untopical, and so you can make topicality arguments. And even if that wasn't the case, if an affirmative case isn't significant, then you'd probably just be better off attacking the harms, because those harms are probably not very large either. But regardless, it's still important you know it, because there's some people that might value this stock issue more than I personally do. What does this look like? So there's a lot of different ways that the affirmative might structure their case to incorporate the stock issues. Sometimes you'll see people identify them by name. They'll be like, observation 1 is inherency, and then they'll read a card or a piece of evidence that says the AF plan hasn't happened yet. And then they'll say harms, and they'll identify harms. Plan, they'll read the plan. Solvency. But that being said, debate has evolved a lot since then, and so there's a lot of people that will just incorporate the stock issues into their advantages rather than allocating them their own sections. So here's an example of an affirmative case. This was from 2 years ago, because at the time that I originally made this, we weren't even started with the Arctic topic yet. But just an example of a case that does the more traditional approach, where they have 1AC inherency, and they read a piece of evidence about their inherency, and then they read the plan. They decided to neglect harms, but that's because the harms are in this advantage. But then they do have a solvency point where they give specific evidence talking about how their plan solves, or more particularly, these pieces of evidence argue what the plan does, since they don't have any particular harms that they identify, and the solvency for the harms that are in the advantage are also in the advantage. So what these ones end up doing is they kind of just explain why the plan generally is able to function. Like this first one says that their program harmonizes patenting standards. So it's like, we make it to where the patent standards are the same, and that's good. This one says that they fast-track green technology patents. This one says that is key to, or strengthening patents is key to innovation. And so they have some just cards that explain why the plan is generally good, even though they don't identify any particular harms independent of the advantage, and function, or explain how the plan functions to solve. And then they have an advantage, which I don't think we have. Yeah, no, we don't have the rest of this advantage, but in it identifies a big risk and impact, if you will, that needs to be solved for, and that impact is a harm. And then in the advantage, they also identify how the plan solves for that harm. We'll get into more advantages and disadvantages at a later date, though. So this one is a more technical version of a 1AC. I've got the navigation pane here. As you can see, they don't label any stock issues. They just have the plan and the two advantages. But within these, they have the stock issues, and we'll go ahead and identify that how that is. So this one is where they identify kind of the uniqueness or the inherency of the plan. So currently, the United States is hostile towards the blockchain, is what they identify, which is like a cryptocurrency thing. You don't need to understand that to understand what we're saying, because they're talking about how currently the United States is hostile, and that's killed U.S. digital leadership. So the United States is not a digital leader. So the plan's goal is to make the United States a digital leader. I'm thinking these two. So whatever the plan is, I did this a long time ago, but it looks like the plan did something to solve the United States' interaction with NFTs and cryptocurrency. And so they identify, here's what the plan does to solve this problem that we identify. So we are not currently doing good on NFTs and cryptocurrency, But the plan fixes that. That's good because it solves for the tech race. And if China wins the tech race, then we will go extinct for some reason. Pretty ludicrous, but point is they have this harm of a existential threat, a Taiwan invasion, uh, losing the tech race, causing nuclear war. These are all harms that they intend to solve for by solving for blockchain growth, as they say. Um, and so they have the stock issues functionally in this advantage, as they would probably argue if you press them on it. Now, some people don't like that, and it's important that we understand both of these functions because we might be in a round where a judge is totally used to reading these or seeing these types of plans. And in more technical formats of debate with more technical judges, you're probably going to come into that situation. But um, and if you make arguments like you don't read the stock issues, you're not really gonna be persuasive to that judge because they're like they don't really care about that. But then some judges do care about that a lot. And if they see a plan like this, making arguments like you don't fit under the stock issues would actually be really strategic. And so being able to understand what your judge is going to like to see is pretty important. But that's an example of the two different ways that people can structure their cases in the modern day. Um, yeah, so how does the second example meet the stock issues? Inherency, they can argue their uniqueness evidence proves their inherency, slash, they can argue that they only have to read inherency evidence. Like if they have a card that says, we have not done whatever the plan is, they can read that in the 2AC if the negative argues against it. It's an argument that people will make. The harms they try to solve for is the extinction and their advantage. They read evidence that the affirmative prevents the thing that they say will cause extinction if left unchecked. And then topicality. Most people across the board, even in these more like lay rounds where you have judges that are very traditional about their views of debate, historically the affirmative is not really needed to prove that they're topical in the 1AC. That was a thing a very long time ago, but has never been a thing in my time in debate. It's been that long. So, just like how we talked about inherency above, they only have to prove they're topical if the negative argues that they're not. Enforcing stock issues, are they a rule? No, in most organizations, stock issues are not a rule, and technical judges don't really like to vote on stuff like that. Like they don't really want to vote on an argument relating to how the plan is organized. Even if if you're debating in a format, like say your state or local rule book says you have to debate the stock issues. If you've got a more technical judge in the back of the room, even if it says it in the rules, they still might be like, I don't want to vote on that because that feels rather silly. And we'll talk about that at the end of this slide. But when people don't meet the stock issues, it's still important that you know why meeting the stock issues matter. That's because you can use those arguments as reasons why they should lose the debate rather than saying they broke imaginary rules. So I said solvency in here, but we'll talk about solvency. So let's go over this example. So let's say they don't have solvency, and you say they don't have solvency. That's a stock issue. That means they should lose. This is an example of a bad argument in favor of someone having the stock issues. Let's look at a good one. So they don't have solvency. That means they can't solve their harms, and so there's no reason to risk the disadvantages that come with the AF because the AF doesn't provide a meaningful benefit. This is a reason why not having solvency actually tangibly matters. The example I was thinking about audibling to is about inherency. So for the same method, they don't have inherency. That's a stock issue. That means they should lose. It's a bad argument. Alternatively, they don't have inherency. That means that the plan has already happened. And so any arguments I make about the plan, you can just say those arguments are inevitable because the plan has already happened. And so I lose all of that ground. So allowing the affirmative to defend something that's already happened puts the negative in a really bad spot because all of their arguments now no longer are quote unquote unique. And we'll get into that later, but it means they're going to happen no matter what we do. And so it's not a reason to vote against the affirmative, which is why inherency is so important. But that's an example of why you can argue inherency matters without relying on backing up that claim with it's a rule. Um, some people will argue that they don't need to meet the stock issues, and that's why they aren't a rule is especially relevant. A lot of the time, people arguing against the idea of stock issues are going to be defending what are called KAFs or critical affirmatives. I'm going to be covering these more in a later video, but they're oftentimes critical of the historical styles of policy debate that we're learning in these lectures. And so it's important to understand that not everyone will agree with these things that I'm telling you. And it's generally just a norm, like I said, and ultimately we'll have to have that debate if we're ready to have that debate about, are the things I'm teaching you about stock issues good? And if you're interested in potentially learning some of those different alternative ways to debate, we'll talk about those as well in future lectures. Yeah, so remember, it's important to know the why behind these every issue, but including the stock issues, and not just the what. A lot of debaters will bore judges by making statements regarding how stock issues impact debate, but rather we would like to make arguments about why stock issues should impact a debate in a certain way. Thank you so much. Tune in for the next one. This one's a little bit longer, but we're covering kind of a core principle of debate. So I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.